You organize your essay around 5 ethics.
Yes.
Ethics of human survival, normative ethics, ethics of protection, institutional ethics, and the ethics of the human predicament, which was an interesting way to approach the subject. You argue each of these has marked the UN's contributions on human rights, but that it is particularly in the area of normative rights, normative ethics, where the UN has made its greatest contributions to the cause of human rights. And yes, you note the UN now faces what you call a tottering consensus. What made it possible in the first 75 years, even including the Cold War years, to make this normative progress? And why are these norms now under such challenge?
Well, you see, if one looks at the drafting of national declarations on human rights, the process is one in which people had grievances. They sought correction of those grievances. They made claims about rights. They articulated principles, and then they negotiated these principles. There is a book by a woman called Loy, however you say it, Loy Schwerer, Schwoerer. And she wrote about the drafting of the English Declaration of Rights, the Bill of Rights. And this was the process. And if you let me say so, it's a process in relation to the French Declaration, the American Declaration, grievances, claims, normative statements, negotiations, recognition of rights. So now it's the same process that has taken place at the international level. If we go back to the early years of the United Nations, the Holocaust, the launching of the Universal Declaration, in all of these processes, the Universal Declaration, the 2 covenants, the subsequent conventions, so you have a number of things happening. You may have a governmental initiative for a norm, for a proposed normative instrument. Often you have an NGO initiative. And so now the idea is launched that the UN should draft some rights. I remember when the UN Declaration on the Rights of Persons to Freedom of Religion or Belief was drafted. It was a very difficult negotiation. But so now, what your question to me is, what contributed to the success? Mm-hmm. Is this combination of governmental engagement, governmental negotiations, push from the NGOs, and persistence over a period of time. And there were many things that, for example, the Universal Declaration recognizes the right to property, but the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights does not. That's part of the horse trading that took place. So at the end of the day, the answer that I want to give you, if I may, is that it is a patient process, a persistent process involving well-disposed governments, involving NGOs, involving academics. The vision of an international Bill of Rights was first put forward by the great Sir Herschel Lauterpacht. He wrote for the American Jewish, I get into trouble all of the time, whether it's the American Jewish Congress or the American Jewish Committee, but he wrote for one of them a draft of an international Bill of Rights, and he put this work in his landmark work, an international Bill of Rights, so that it is this persistent combination. And now let me give you an example, if I may. At the time when the idea was launched that there should be an international convention on the rights of the child, this idea came, for whatever reason, this idea came from the government of Poland. And the Western governments at the time, they were skeptical of this. Why is Poland pushing the idea of a convention on the rights of the child? But then the NGOs saw merit in this, and the NGOs owned this process. And then the NGOs brought in UNICEF into the process, and over time. So It's I'm repeating myself now, but it is this persistent, patient process of commitment, negotiations, and compromise that has resulted in. And nowadays, I want to say this: if the United Nations publishes a collection of human rights documents of the United Nations system and of some of the regional organizations, and there's hardly an area of the relationship between the individual and the state that you will not find a normative provision covering it. So that I put the normative provisions as one of the great successes of the UN, because I think U Thant once addressed the International Law Commission, on which, by the way, I did my doctoral thesis. And U Thant said to the International Law Commission, the work that you are doing is for the long term. And so that these instruments in human rights are for the long term. So anyhow, you asked me how that came about, and I've gone on a little bit, as you can see. Yeah.